Hey kids, Mrs. Croft here again. Today we're going to learn about a special person. But first, let's go through our vocabulary words again. Botanist. A botanist is a scientist who studies plants. So say the word botanist. Botanist. Botany is the study of those plants. Botany. Crops. Crops are plants that are grown in large numbers for people to use. The farmer planted 3 different crops. He planted corn, he planted soybeans, he planted wheat. We eat crops. You may even think about a crop of potatoes. Well, let's get on with our story today. You're going to learn about another person who became famous, and because of his love for plants. That's why he became famous. Now, remember when we talk about a person's life history or things that they did, it's called a biography. Will you say the word biography? And so this is a true story, and it is about this person's events in his life. Here's a picture. You're going to hear about a man who was like kind of Johnny Appleseed, but he became famous because of his love for plants. But do you remember that Johnny Appleseed did what he did that made him famous? That's right. He planted lots of apple trees. So he too, this man lived many years ago, but not quite as long as Johnny Appleseed. His name is George Washington Carver. I wonder if his mom named him George Washington because she liked George Washington. But his name was George Washington Carver. He became famous through the United States and was known as a botanist. Remember, a botanist is a scientist who studies plants. So George first developed his interest in plants when he was a young boy. As a child, George used his free time to explore the forests surrounding his home on a farm in Missouri. Now, Missouri is a state down way at the bottom, kind of by Florida, Texas, Louisiana. It's over in there, just up from, I believe it's up from Alabama. You can look on a map and have someone show you where Missouri is. He spent many hours roaming those woods, discovering all sorts of wonderful things. George liked to collect things that caught his eye. Now, when something catches your eye, that means you kind of see it and then you look more than once at it. And you keep looking. George was especially curious about different kinds of plants. He noticed that during his explorations, he would notice lots of different kinds of plants, and he wanted to study these plants further. But he knew if he pulled them out of the ground and took them back to the cabin, they would die. Why would the plants die? Yeah, what do plants need to survive? Food, water, air, space. So when George found an interesting plant, he would carefully dig around it and dig it up and remove it from the place where it was growing, making sure it had its roots and all was intact, so he could plant it in a special garden close to his cabin. A garden is a plot of land where plants are grown. You may have a garden at your house. You may have a small garden in a plant pot. George moved plant after plant to this special garden where he looked after each and every plant, watering and caring for them to make sure they continued to grow. As an adult, George later wrote, "I literally lived in the woods. I wanted to know every strange stone, flower, insect, bird, or beast. Day after day, I spent time in the woods alone in order to collect my floral beauties and put them in my little garden I had hidden in a brush not far from the house." So he collected plants. How many of you have a collection? It's probably not plants, and you may have not ever planted a secret garden. Fascinated by plants in his garden, George spent hours. He tended those plants. In other words, he took care of them. He observed them and studied them, and in time, he learned about the special needs of each and every plant, how much water they would need, whether it would grow best in the sunlight or maybe with a little shade. George also took a special interest in caring for plants that were not growing very well. He became so skillful at caring for these sick plants that the people throughout the neighborhood began to call him the plant doctor. His passion for plants led him to develop another talent. He became an artist. Of course, his favorite subjects to paint were plants because he loved his beloved plants. Though he did not have a proper canvas, that's the part that you paint on, or paints, he improvised. Improvised means he made do with what he had. A canvas is something you'll paint on, and when you improvise, that means you make do with something of whatever you have. George made his first paints from different plant parts. Paint from plant parts? He was an amazing, remarkable man. He mashed up bark roots and berries and other roots and used them to paint on old boards or even flat rocks. George continued to paint throughout his entire life. Looks like he does a very good job, and he's just painting on a board. Here's a photo of George. This is what he looked like. George was truly a remarkable and talented person. He was an excellent student who learned quickly, and he went on to study at a college. Eventually, there's that word we've used before. Eventually, he didn't become this first, but he became it later. He became an expert at botany. Remember, botany is the study of plants. And after he finished college, George became a professor at a famous university in Alabama. That's a state in the United States. There, in Alabama, he spent the rest of his life continuing to study plants and experiment with ways to make them grow better. He discovered many ways to help farmers improve how they grew their plants and crops on their farms. He also helped people who were sick. Some plants help them to overcome their sickness, but you have to be very careful and know what plants do. George encouraged farmers to grow crops rather than just cotton. Especially, he liked peanuts and sweet potatoes. He also found many ways to use these peanuts in different types of products like dyes, oils, and makeup. Yep, girls, there might be peanuts in your makeup. He even came up with a number of recipes for foods that used peanuts. George Washington Carver is especially remembered for these discoveries today. Look, soap, peanut butter, food coloring, makeup, oil for our cars, and food. Plants give us a lot of things. Thank you, Mr. George Washington Carver. Now, what two plants did he encourage farmers to grow? Let's just check. He encouraged farmers to plant peanuts and sweet potatoes, these two items right here, instead of cotton. How did George Carver learn so much about plants? If you said he took care of them when he was a young child, you were right. Why was George Washington Carver called the plant doctor? Right, he took care of sick plants and he helped other people take care of their plants as well and taught them. How did George Washington Carver make his paint? Right, he made them from plants like bark and roots, and he mashed up berries. He used lots of plant parts to make his paint. Thank you. Word work. Let's work on some words. In the read aloud, you heard George Washington Carver discovered many ways to help farmers improve how they grew plants and crops on their farms. Say the word crops. Crops. Crops are plants that are grown in large numbers for people to use. The farmer grew wheat and corn crops for people to eat. What other types of plants do you think could be grown as crops? Will you discuss this with someone and let them know what you know about crops? What's the word we've been talking about? Crops. Tell me one kind of crop you would like to grow. Discuss that with someone. Thank you for listening today, and thank you for listening to a story, a biography about who? George Washington Carver. Yes, that was the biography. It was a short one, but we learned a lot. We will be doing a domain review and a test over our domain the next time we meet. So be ready and think about plants and soil and saplings and pollination. And if you'd like, you can go back and listen to all the stories that we've heard previously. Thanks for listening. Hope you learned a lot. And thanks for learning.